Okay, are you hearing me? Oh, shoot. This is Keith Mueller. Are you hearing me? My microphone is on. Shoot. Hello? Nobody's hearing me yet? I'm showing that I'm on here, but I'm not coming through apparently. Okay, everybody is hearing me. Then I'm going to go ahead and assume that and do the share screen and bring up the PowerPoint. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry about this. Having trouble getting that to work. Well, all of you have the slides. If I don't succeed, I'll have you scroll through the slides on your own. Let me know in the messages if that can work for you. If I thought I had this all lined up this morning, but I may need to log off and come back on with a different browser. Try one more time with this one. If it doesn't work, I'll log off and back on really quickly. Get to the other browser. Okay, I'm just going to let you link to the PowerPoint and I'll tell you how to scroll through slides. Sorry about that. I thought I had this all worked out with the browser this morning and it's failing me now. So to start with the first slide then, this is a presentation about policy dynamics affecting rural resilience. Second slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Rural Policy Research Institute, which is the institute that I direct now at the University of Iowa. We're a great resource for you with a lot of material on the website that appears on the first line of this slide. Our mission is to undertake unbiased research and analysis on the challenges, needs, and opportunities facing rural America. I know I'm reading from the slide, but that's okay. Some of you may not have it up. Improve the understanding of impacts of public policies and facilitate dialogue and collaboration. Our vision is that rural people and places have the resources and capacities to create strong, viable, meaningful, and sustainable futures that can withstand and turn to their advantage forces that are out there in globalization, economic, demographic, and social change. The way we do this is providing timely, empirically based, nonpartisan policy advice. We were formed in 1990 and by the way, I forgot to say next slide. So should be looking at a slide whose first bullet is provide timely, empirically based. We were formed in 1990 at the urging of members of the U.S. Senate from both parties, from the states of Missouri, Iowa, Arkansas, and Nebraska. We have moved forward since then and now are based at the University of Iowa. Initially, we were at the University of Missouri. And our base of support has broadened considerably from what it was initially, which was support from Congress to set this up and get it going. Now, because of being active in different portfolios like my activity and health, it's a broader base of support. But we've never lost sight of the action, which is this providing timely, empirically based and nonpartisan advice. And I really emphasize nonpartisan. That's what is our mantra. And makes us effective. We foster an understanding of and a search for effective solutions to issues facing people and communities in rural America, and provide a place for everybody to be able to openly discuss concerns. We like to think of it as a safe place for people to get into conversations that aren't influenced by partisan or ideological perspectives. You bring those to the table so we all understand them, but it's not what drives the discussion. And we encourage collaboration and common purpose among scholars from all around the country to pursue research that supports effective policy and practice. And we work with institutions and agencies that have the expertise, the resources, and responsibilities to impact rural people and places. I think of it a lot, and I'm on the next slide now, policy settings for action. I think of it a lot in terms of two levels, if you will, of policy, and that's what the slide looks like. Local and state policy. We have a history of helping state and local government officials think through governance structure and design. And we focus a lot now through our Center for Local and State Policy on local and state-based community development. I mean, I'm coming to you from Nashville today because I spoke yesterday at the Council of State Legislatures, the Southern region of the State Legislative Council. And that's an example of focusing around community development and bringing to them some of what I'm sharing with you here this morning. In national policy, we look at policy development, implementation, and comparative policy, including over the years, we've had collaborative activity with OECD, that's the Western European countries, and a Pan-American collaboration, particularly with Mexico. We have different areas of work within the RUPRI structure and umbrella. So I'm on that slide now, RUPRI areas of work. We talk about arts and community, something called the Next Generation Initiative. That's a partnership between RUPRI and Art of the Rural. Over the years, we've done a lot to try to bring up the new generation of leadership across different fields in rural places. The Rural Cultural Wealth Lab is a relatively new entity. It was started with funding support from the National Endowment of the Arts, the NEA. Even as that funding finished, because that was a 3-year funding cycle, we established the lab. It continues to be very viable and active. We're looking now toward a couple of conferences coming up as we come out of the pandemic and are able to actually get people around a table again to move forward with research related to the importance of cultural wealth in rural communities, how we measure that, how we measure its impact, and you'll see it the second half of this presentation, how we measure its interaction with other capitals. Our Center for Local and State Policy, I've already mentioned that. That's located at Ball State University. Very active in community-based development using the comprehensive wealth framework that I will be describing in a bit, and you'll see that I'm actually using slides from the Home Institute at Ball State, in which the Center for Local and State Policy resides. Population and Place Analytics, which we fondly refer to as PAPA, is an analytical group. The chair of that group is at Louisiana State University. It includes faculty from the University of Montana, from the University of Iowa, from Ball State, from the University of Oregon, and emeritus faculty from Purdue. They do a lot of work to develop things like the comprehensive wealth framework and the analytic tools that we need to help advance sustainability and resilience in rural places. The fifth area of work is the one I'm most engaged in myself. I've been the director of these entities you see on the screen since they were created. And so I've considered myself as managing and running the health portfolio for RUPRI, which includes an expert panel that's been around now since 1992, advising particularly policy staff at the national level. So we have been engaged in discussions of major legislation over the years, including the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, its predecessor, the Health Security Act, which didn't pass, but a lot of the elements showed up in later legislation. We're very pleased with our role of making sure that the policymakers understand the real implications of policies that they are considering. The Center for Rural Health Policy Analysis that I direct at the University of Iowa is funded by the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy for most of its work, and it does annual projects on specific policy questions. The Rural Health Value Initiative, which has its own website, ruralhealthvalue.org, is an partnership between us and Stratus Health, and it's designed to help providers in the field who are trying to transform how they deliver care, how they organize it, and participate in transforming how care is paid for. And that's really the emphasis that we have with the Rural Health Value Initiative. RUPRI also participates in the Rural Health Information Hub, a great resource for any of you who are interested in health issues at the rural America. It's run out of the University of North Dakota, staffed primarily by outstanding librarians and information specialists who know how to find the resources, how to organize them, and present them to all the user community, all of us, in a very effective way. So I encourage you, if you have questions about health, rural health, that's a great initial resource, along with, of course, coming to places like our center and panel. Next slide. RUPRI uses, excuse me, a couple of frameworks, two frameworks to guide a lot of what we do. One of those is, and I'll do these each in turn. One is specific to health, the High Performance Rural Healthcare System framework that the Health Panel created and uses, which is currently being updated. And the Comprehensive Rural Wealth Framework, which comes out of that analytic team, and has guided our work with the Rural Wealth Lab, Rural Cultural Lab, and will guide a lot of what we do at RUPRI. So these two frameworks guide our research, our policy analysis, our assessment, our local action. This is the High Performance Rural Health System. That's the next slide, and that's the title of the slide. This is a framework developed by the panel in 2011. As I said a minute ago, it is being updated now. In fact, the draft is something I'm carrying with me that as I have time, I continue to polish up. And the panel, and this is the vision statement for the high performing, we're changing that from performance to performing rural health system. It's a system and services that are affordable and accessible to everybody. It's a sustainable system that delivers high quality, high value services. And that second sentence of that statement is really important. A high performing rural health system informed by the needs of each unique rural community and population groups that therein will lead to greater community health and well-being. So if you think of this, it's at a higher level of what we're looking for. It's not specific to a particular healthcare organization. It's a community-based, community-driven vision of what a high-performing rural health system looks like. The system has four pillars. That's the slide I'm looking at now, pillars of a high-performing rural health system. The pillars of accessibility, affordability, community health, and quality. Staying on that slide for just a minute, I'll briefly describe each of those four. Accessibility means that I can receive the services I need and the essential services, which we tend to think about primary health care, public health, emergency services locally, but that I also, through local providers, have the ability to access care elsewhere as needed in a comprehensive coordinated manner. Affordability is being affordable to the individual and household, as well as being affordable to the system and to, if it's publicly supported, to the public sector. So a lot of issues dealing with how we try to control healthcare costs come into play. Community health is our effort to say, as I did a few minutes ago, this is beyond thinking about a particular healthcare organization. It's at a higher level of generalizability. Those of us in the field of public health, I'm in a college of public health at the University of Iowa, think of it a lot in terms of it's the health of everybody in the community, not just each individual. And quality clearly is focused around measurable elements of quality. If you think about clinical quality, it also incorporates notions about quality means a patient-driven, patient-centered, we like to think of it even as person-centered system. So the individual is at the center of attention and focus, and that's a strong element of quality. So that's how we look at it in healthcare. The next slide gets us into the comprehensive rural wealth framework. And just by glancing at the picture, you can tell that this is it's complicated, but I'll simplify it. And if you look at those three central premises, that begins to simplify this a bit, that think about wealth in terms of it's the stock, if you will, of all assets. So what you build up, if you think about your own individual portfolios, that's how we think of it. Well, think of it that way for the rural community or rural place, how it builds that stock. And how you build the stock depends on benefits that flow from the assets that are in that circle. And I'll be looking at each in turn: human, social, political, cultural, physical, natural, financial, and intellectual. The second premise is that all of those are interconnected, as indicated in that circle diagram. And changing one impacts others. And the impact can be negative as well as positive. And when it's negative, you have to balance that in considering how to make an investment in an asset. So if you're investing in extraction of natural resources, for example, you would recognize that that's going to have perhaps a very strong financial positive benefit to the area, jobs generated, investment capital coming in, but it will have some impact on the natural capital in the community. So you wouldn't reject doing the investment in financial, but you'd think about the interaction with natural, try to control the potential negative impact, but then also do it in a way that may reinforce what are the natural community assets. So the way in which you extract the resources, for example, how you repurpose the land if you're doing any kind of open mining activity and you've completed that, how do you repurpose the land? That those are examples of the interaction across those capitals. And you want to do it in a way, going back to premise one, that continues in the aggregate to build the assets and retain them in the community. And the last central premise is that community well-being then is based in a comprehensive understanding of wealth across those capitals. So let me walk you through those capitals one at a time. So on this next slide, we're looking at the comprehensive wealth framework, financial capital. So financial capital is fairly easy to think of, things like letters of credit, stocks, bonds, but it can also include then the investment into the community. So if you're thinking of new capital flowing in and building up some of the other capitals of the community, social, human, because the financial capital is there, maybe in stocks and bonds, maybe in physical infrastructure that you've developed. Natural capital, this is clean air and water. It's something that is of high value in most of rural America. Landscapes, forests, mountains, rivers, climate, land. It's what makes the place truly attractive as a place to live and as a place for further investment. recognizing again that what makes it attractive is also then at some risk depending on the type of investment in the other capitals. Physical or built capital. This is equipment, buildings, telecommunications, which is a major consideration for us in health right now as we look at the need for continued expansion of broadband capacity if we're going to take advantage of where we are in telehealth. Roads, bridges, all of that is the physical built capital. Human capital, educational attainment, health status in the area. So you notice for someone who's been immersed in health like I am, there's no health capital in here. It's because our interest in health shows up, in the other capitals, and here health status is part of human capital. Skills, talents. A comment about human capital. When we think about different ways of developing the area, bringing new employment, et cetera, we should think about the human capital dimension of that. So this is where you get into discussions of what types of jobs are you bringing to the community, and how might that impact human capital. If you are flipping the ownership of some of the other assets, like the built capital in the community, and I'm thinking of one I'm somewhat familiar with, where the ownership of a local manufacturing effort changed from local ownership to national to international. And that meant that jobs remained in the community, but some of the mid to higher level management jobs left the community over time as they migrated to regional or national headquarter offices of the firms that bought the local one. That's a shift then in skills and talents of the human capital and in educational attainment of the human capital. So another way to think about, another example of the interaction and the interactive dynamics of this framework of thinking about all 8 capitals at once. Social capital, that's something we typically think is strong in rural America because it's built on relationships and networks. And we just think logically, if you have a smaller array of key players, key organizations, key organizational leaders, that it should be easier to build the social capital. We may think that that's not always the case, and it may actually be more difficult if the interests are entrenched and in opposition and do not trust each other, and you only have a handful. That can be challenging. As an example of how to deal with that, we looked at a study in one rural county in the health and human services arena and found that in order to bring all the key players around the table and build the relationships and trust, a third party trusted entity, in this case it was a local foundation, created an initiative to bring everybody around the table and work through some of their apprehensions and historical mistrust to build that trust and relationship, and then had a strong network in health and human services serving that local county. Political capital, this is influence, power, goodwill, and how that builds in the local rural community. It's also, we think of this beyond it's just as we do in healthcare, beyond the rural community, and think about the interactions and the dynamics at different levels of political influence. So speaking with state legislatures yesterday and state legislative officials, I was bringing the rural voice or rural perspective to people, some of whom had it because their districts were rural, some who did not, and talking through, okay, what at the state level, and the political capital becomes then what is the capital of the rural community they bring to the statewide discussions here in Tennessee, where I am today, Missouri, where I live, or Iowa, where I work. How do you bring that in to those discussions? Cultural capital, the obvious arts and architecture, places of cultural significance. I often focus on those last 2 bullets on this slide about comprehensive wealth framework, the beliefs and traditions of the local community. With our cultural wealth lab, We've done a lot of work now with the American Indian population. We're doing a lot of work with the persons of color in the region of the country I'm sitting in today, here in Tennessee and south of here in particular. And I'm always intrigued by that because I learn so much when I learn about beliefs and traditions of people in different places and of different cultural backgrounds. And considering that to be an asset of the local community that can actually feed into some of the other capitals or becomes essential to attract people to fill out the other capitals in the diagram. Intellectual capital are things like patents and copyrights, common knowledge. What is intellectual property that can be built and sustained in a local environment? So that was a run through of the 8 capitals. This is coming around to a summary then of how people like me, at least, think about this. I think about people-based assets. So I think about education and health, experience people have, the culture and the values they have, the relationships, the property and real estate that they own, the stocks and bonds that they own. Those are all people-based assets that we need to build and sustain in rural places. Place-based assets, things like housing stock. Well, that's an issue getting a lot of national visibility now in urban America. It's an issue in rural America as well. The age of the housing stock that is there, the absence of adequate housing when you are building rural communities and expanding them is a glaring issue for us. Public infrastructure, environmental quality, the social networks, those are all place-based assets. What are the policy implications? And this is the next slide of thinking about that. The comprehensive wealth framework is a superior basis for assessing economic performance because it considers benefits and costs of non-market effects. It's not as simple. I mean, the whole idea of the comprehensive wealth framework grew out of a dissatisfaction with simply using the gross domestic product as the measure of performance, wealth performance in any area, including rural America. And that was just purely this sort of notion of dollar flow. Well, it's much more than that, as you can see from the 8 capitals. And this gives us a way of looking at it that way, and considers the returns on investment in across those capitals. And I listed them back out again in that bullet. Secondly, another major implication is it clarifies the concept of sustainability. Because sustainability, which is so vital, is really sustaining the growth in comprehensive wealth. So again, thinking across those elements, when my colleagues in CLASP, that Center for Local and State Policy, are in a community, which they do a lot of this work, they introduce the comprehensive wealth framework and they talk about you want to build in each of those capitals as best as possible. You may focus in one, but never lose sight that the total mosaic is all 8 of those combined. And it recognizes finally the complexities among those types of capital. And I've given you examples of environment being natural capital being affected by what you do in financial or built capital, environmental in place affecting health, the intellectual capital interacting with natural capital are all examples of the complementarity among the types of capital. So where does that leave us going forward? Well, this next slide, I talk about how we're primed now to advance in rural resilience coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I sincerely hope, as I know everyone else does, that we are coming out of it, that the new variant won't set us back again. But what have we learned as we've been dealing with that pandemic for the last 15 to 18 months? We've learned a lot about investing in rural people and places and the importance of doing so wisely. The lessons from COVID-19, I give you a website there, ruprihealth.org, and you can see the latest rural data and maps about where we are in cases, death rates, in rural America. We track that and put out maps on a weekly basis for the data on that site. We've learned about the value of being prepared for any public health emergency, and particularly emergencies like a pandemic that spreads, as somebody today pointed out to me. I'm in the College of Health Sciences here at Tennessee State. One of my colleagues pointed out, well, this is a virus. It behaves on its own, and to try to gain control of it, we've learned the value of being ready to do that. We've also learned the value of being aware of its effects in some places that we've labeled as hotspots. And our work over the last 18 months at our Rural Research Center has identified those and helped people think through, what do we need to do? How do we need to move some resources around? That's drawing attention to matching resources. How do you move ventilators around among hospitals? And it has given us evidence of under-resourced places in rural America that we always knew about, but sometimes you feel like you're speaking into the wind. People who see a pandemic come along and see the difficulty of managing the care and taking care of people because we do have under-resourced places. We have an opportunity to bring that to everyone's attention and leverage some resources to address that. Coming out of the pandemic, we should be laying the groundwork for the future, which requires investment and focus on rural resilience. What do we mean by that? The next slide: investing in rural people and places. It's a nonpartisan policy objective, is recovery and sustainability. Investment strategies in the context of the comprehensive framework, the wealth framework, take advantage of stated priorities. Broadband is, and I heard this yesterday, as each of the states in the committee meeting that I went to were reporting, every single one of them reported new strategies for investing in broadband. We need to take advantage of that and make sure that that reaches where it needs to reach in rural. Same thing with transportation and the infrastructure package that appears to be working through Congress right now. Underserved populations has generated a lot of interest in the Biden administration. And again, speaking from my knowledge from yesterday in a lot of state governments, making sure everybody remembers rural is an underserved population. And then within rural, places like hotspots, et cetera, where we really need to focus the investment. And ultimately, it's the rural people that are the focus of our attention for the investments. We need to think about, and I've moved to the next slide, rural resilience. And that's the region's ability to withstand economic and other shocks and recover quickly, as quickly as possible, from things like the recession, 2008 and 9, and now the pandemic. So that can be a shock. Climate-induced catastrophes like droughts in rural America, trade fluctuations are also examples of shocks that require resilience. And the resilience is a function of the underlying capital wealth. And I again refer back to that framework to understand that as best as possible, which returns me ultimately to the theme of investing in rural places and people. My concluding remarks, I'm on the last substantive slide. You can follow our work that I introduced you to at the beginning off of our website. I encourage everyone to engage in policy development and implementation and invest in resilience by applying the frameworks that we suggest. The other slides in the presentation are contact information and information about other resources. So I think I backed out of shared screen. And I can now see your comments, so I wanted to take those. So if you, and I forgot to say that before I started, to type those in as we went along. Anything that you wanted to hear more about or questions that you have. We have a few minutes remaining in our allotted 45-minute time frame. Has there been any new research on using telemedicine for rural healthcare? Yes, there has. Trying to think of sort of a synthesis of some of that. There is a rural telehealth research center. If you type that into Google, it'll take you to their site. I know about it because it's down the hall from me when I'm in my offices at the University of Iowa. They have studies that they put out in policy briefs. There's a center for telemedicine located it's housed out of a place in California. They're a great resource. And you can also go to the Rural Health Information Hub, and they have an information guide on telemedicine, which will give you the latest research that they've identified. And as I said, they're great librarians. They're always searching for new sources and put it into their information guide. So I highly recommend going there to see what's ongoing. I know that we're going to be looking at it on our health panel in August to see what we've learned during the pandemic. A final comment about that. Many of the waivers that enabled a lot more use of telemedicine during the pandemic are scheduled to end at the end of the emergency or the calendar year. But there's legislation in Congress to extend all of those waivers for an additional year so we can do more research and learn from them. Insight on impact of vaccine levels in rural areas. It's disappointingly low in a lot of rural America. If you overlay where the lowest counties are with the rural map, it's a pretty obvious overlay. It's a challenge to overcome natural resistance to vaccines generally and to the COVID vaccine in particular. It's not too bad of a challenge, frankly, of distribution. We've learned a lot about how to make the vaccines available, but we didn't learn enough and I'm in the College of Public Health, we didn't learn enough from our public health colleagues in communication on how to get people to understand the importance of the vaccine and then get the vaccine. Is it affecting the rural businesses to get employees? I don't know for sure, Vic. I suspect it is. I expect it's one of the factors that's leading to difficulty getting employees in places like even fast food places in a county with a low vaccination rate. That could be a contributing factor, but I've not seen the hard research on that. Do I recommend outreach with influencers? My recommendation, and I've said this when been asked because of our work, I get asked by reporters too. My recommendation is find the people in the community who agree with the importance of vaccination, who have some of that trust locally. They are the ones who can best communicate the importance of the vaccine. And that will vary, just like our statement in the health panel's vision for a high performing. We said unique in each rural community, who the leadership might be and who the trusted people are that also agree with the importance of the message can vary place by place. It can be ministers in one community, it can be physicians in another, it can be the veterans community in another. Finding them and working with them is the best way. Coming in from the outside to try to do that, difficult and can actually backfire. We're still open. I'm happy to take other questions. I agree entirely with you, Vic. It is a sad situation. Other questions? If not, when the timer ends, I'll just close out the broadcast. We were allowed to go a little over if there were any last minute questions. I want to thank everybody for tolerating me using the browser that wasn't functioning for me today, and you bringing up the slides on your own. I appreciate that. Otherwise, I was going to have to log off and back on with a different browser. What can leaders do to amplify our message? Follow it and communicate it. A lot of it is very small group communication, and because that's what spreads. It's kind of like that diagram of the social network. That's really how things spread, is through networks, and then that's how messages like ours can be amplified. And having discussions like the one I had yesterday with state legislators, who heard a message at the beginning of their meeting about always listening to the other side, a quote from Howard Baker when he was Senate Majority Leader. Again, thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.